Welcome to a special behind the scenes episode of Your Business Growth Podcast. What we're going to be covering today are episode plans. This is what I use before I put together an episode and actually record and live stream. This gives me an arc that I can follow so my guests aren't wondering what we're going to be talking about. It lets me have more of a narrative and deliver quality content for my audience. We all know that feeling of staring at a blank piece of paper or hopping on to a recording with no prep. You're unprepared, the conversation meanders, you learn things and are surprised at directions that your guest has gone, sometimes too late in the episode. And you end up with an okay episode when you could have a great episode. And for me, an episode plan helps us to get there. So let's look behind the scenes at what is involved, how we put the plan together. I'll go over what I do from a planning process, how we do guest screening, what that application is like, the research, the pre-interview calls, and most importantly, the episode plan generation. And before I get into that, I just want to have a quick shout out. A friend of mine that I was a guest on their podcast a few times, David Schomer, he was the one who actually shared this idea with me initially of how he crafts plans for his episodes. And immediately after learning about this, I put it into place and I've been using it for every single one of my episodes. Let's jump into it. First step is I'm pretty tight in my screening in terms of criteria of who we invite onto the show. I have three main sources for where we find guests. One, this is one of my favorites, is referrals, people who recommend someone that fits my ideal guest criteria to be on the show. Those are always great. Second place, I use Podmatch, and I've been on there for a few years. Podmatch is fantastic if you're not using this to both find episodes to be on and as a host to find ideal guests. You're missing out. It's a phenomenal community of podcast hosts and guests, and you can connect up and find the right folks for your show. And the third place is outbound requests at a number of different places in my email drip sequences as people have opted in or been on my show and so forth. I mention my podcast, who my ideal guest is, and I ask for an introduction if they know someone that they've worked with that might make a great guest for the show. And so those are my three sources: referrals, Podmatch, and then specific outbound requests for guests. All right, let's jump into the application. Once folks are interested in being on Your Business Growth Podcast, I have an intake form. This is super simple. This is a Google form. It's nothing fancy. It doesn't need to be all tied to your CRM. It's just simply a form with some good screening questions. This gives me a good basis for the story and arc that my guest has. From here, I can find out what's missing or what I need to know. Oftentimes, people will just blast through these forms and their responses are a little too generic. That doesn't give me enough to go on to build an episode. Sometimes they give me everything I'm looking for, and I have a great idea of what our episode will be about. On the application, I have obviously basic contact info. I also like to ask if they have a producer, virtual assistant, team member, someone else that they want me to communicate with on their behalf in putting the episode together. Some folks do, some folks don't. Either way, it's just nice for them to have that field. If you don't do that, what I find is if they do have an agency or someone involved, they're going to put down the agency's info and I'll never know how to reach my guest or connect with them. And by the way, if you're not building relationships and staying in touch with your guests and your hosts, you're missing out on a huge opportunity. So questions I'm asking, since I'm looking to develop an episode on Your Business Growth Podcast specifically for the stories of entrepreneurs who built a business, saw success, then they felt like they plateaued and they weren't seeing the growth that they wanted. They used a strategy from my book, Your Business Growth Playbook, and got back to the growth they deserved. So I'm looking to see that they have an established business, that they've grown, that they plateaued, how they got unstuck, what that was like, and so forth. And again, sometimes I get a really good story, other times I get pieces of it. And then from our conversation on our pre-interview call, we can tease out exactly what that story is. Sometimes folks don't recognize, they're not able to see that forest from the trees. And so they don't even see those points within their story. Or they'll have a bunch of different stories and not really have a good singular story for us to share in the episode. And really, I'm setting them up as the hero and helping to pull that story out from them for our listeners. Based on their application, we then go into a pre-interview call. We actually use my Riverside studio. This is where I record the episodes as well. And by using that, I'm able to see that they're comfortable with the technology. They have a good audio and lighting setup. They're able to use the platform and so forth. I could just hop on a Zoom. Most folks are not used to using Riverside for pre-interview. I like it because it, again, gets them comfortable with what the real production is going to be. So on that pre-interview call, this is just a chance to get to know each other And so there's less surprises. I get to see how they present themselves. I again get to see their AV setup. For the most part, this has not been an issue. I've had some folks that have like really poor lighting and they don't have the greatest equipment. They're talking to me like on their laptop mic, or they're in their kid's bedroom or whatever, right? We want to make sure we're going to be putting together a good production. And so I'm looking out for some of these things on our pre-interview call. We get a chance to know each other. I also get to dig into the story a bit more and really tease out those details, not during the episode, but during this time beforehand. And so here's where we dial in what that narrative arc is going to be. We get to really understand some of those key turning points in their business. And I'm really looking for the pieces that can let me craft a great episode. From here, my goal when we're done is that I've finalized what that arc is, and I know what key strategies they used to get unstuck in their business. Again, that's my show format. Whatever the story is that you're telling on your show, you're going to know what to look for to craft that episode. So from here, after that call, I've got everything I need, and I can go ahead and craft that episode plan. Now, because I have a strict show format and guest criteria, when I do get cold pitches, whether by email or through Podmatch and so forth, about 95 of the pitches I get are not qualified, right? These are people, they have a story they want to tell, but their story doesn't fit the format of my show. So about 95% just get rejected. Or I'll have a follow-up question and I'll ask them about how they might have a story that fits the arc of my show. Almost nobody responds and gets back to me when I ask that question. The ones that do, you can tell they're trying to cram that square peg into a round hole and there's not a fit there, but they're just looking for more visibility and they'll hop on any show with the same generic pitch. Those aren't going to work out. Sometimes they do follow up and we realize there may be an arc, and then that's when I go ahead and invite them to fill out the application, and then we hop on a pre-interview if it makes sense. So those are the 95%. 1% of the pitches and applications I get look great. Right from the get-go, I'm like, this is a story I can't wait to tell. I know it's going to be amazing. And about 4% look promising, but we just need some development. And again, that's what these pre-interview calls are for. All right, so let's get into creating the plan. This is where, after my pre-interview call and their application, I've got a lot of good information on who they are and the story I want to tell. This is where we then do research on our side. Are they an author? Well, if they're an author, go ahead and get their book, right? Learn about their area of expertise and what they cover. I love when I'm interviewing someone, being able to pull up their book and pull out a quote they had from their book or dig into something they shared in the book. It's a great way to connect with them because it's something they felt like was worth putting on paper and in print, and it's a piece of their story. And so we can dig into that further than they might have covered in the book alone. I also look at their social media, their website, etc., to see what they're up to and find different versions of their bio, right? I find different pieces of people's background and story as I look at their bios across different platforms. And then obviously their application, and then my notes from our pre-interview call. Now, for my episode plan, with all of that in hand, I'm looking at what is the core strategy they use for my book, Your Business Growth Playbook, that got them unstuck and back to growth, because I want to make sure I highlight that and tie that back in. So I'm looking for that piece in their strategy selection. I'm also putting together some proposed titles for the episode. Now, what's key here is these need to be a good hook and draw listeners in. It also has to be relevant to the story. I also want it to be unique to their episode and their story, not too generic, right? If you use a lot of AI tools, they're going to go through and take the episode content and come up with some really good and generic titles that can work for any episode. And that's not that exciting. I want to know what is the unique title that I can have for their episode that ties back to their story and what we're going to cover in the episode. I then put together that intro for them in their episode where we introduce the backstory, we create some of that dramatic tension, we hold back on what the strategy is that they used, and we sort of paint the picture of where they were and what it would have meant had they not gotten unstuck and back to the growth they deserve, and we draw that listener into the story so they want to hear more. The episode is where we actually resolve this conflict and we resolve this tension and help to share the actual strategy after we've brought someone through that arc of where this business owner was. Now, as far as the arc, what I'm looking for, this is sort of the same episode structure I have, is I go back to the origins for my guests, like where and when they got started is kind of their backstory. We talk about their early success. Again, this is from my show format. Adjust these to fit your show format. I'm looking to understand where this person saw success in their business, when they hit that revenue plateau and the growth stopped, what strategy they chose to get back to growth, the challenges they had in implementing that, the lessons learned, and then we have our wrap up. And I sort of fill in with 2 to 4 different questions or points within each of those items on my episode plan. And now I'm not going to read every single one of these on the air, but it gives me conversation points that I can cover during that arc. I also put in my episode plan their call to action, their CTA. This might be their website, it might be a LinkedIn follow, it might be their podcast, it might be getting their book. It depends. I ask my guests on their application what their preferred call to action is, their CTA. So I'll mention this and they have a chance to mention that as well in the episode. I also finalize their bio and I make sure they have a chance to look at that. We cover the social links that they shared, make sure I have a link to the quality headshot that they want us to be using, and so forth. Now, much of this they've submitted in their application, but things like the bio, we actually rewrite based on all of our research to be a bio that we think fits a standardized format that we use that still tells their story and is very unique to them. Now, all of this just goes into a Google Doc. I have a Google Doc template that I use every time, and then I share that with my guest and their team if applicable. They are full editors, they have full edit access, and I include a note that mentions they are an editor and they can and should make any changes or revisions as they see fit. Now, I'll share, honestly, most folks don't make any changes at all. Usually what I get back is feedback that this is one of the most organized episode that they've ever had a chance to be on. Now that's great because there's no gotcha questions, there's no surprises, they know the story we're telling, and they go into the episode understanding not to lead with something else later in the story, and that we can touch on that and they know where the things we're talking about are going to fit within this timeline. And that way we're not giving up the strategies too early or later in the episode suddenly going back with a flashback and earlier backstory. We have a structure and a place for each part of our conversation. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know it's not stilted and structured and too rigid where someone's just reading monotone off of a script, right? This provides me an outline and I use that structure to guide that conversation. I don't read every question word for word. Sometimes I skip a question. Sometimes I dig in deeper. And one of my favorite things to do is after I hear back an answer from my guests is I sort of recap and recast what I took away from what they just shared for my audience. That's something that I learned my friend Brad on his podcast, Beyond a Million, does a really good job of. And so I love doing that for the benefit of my guests, just kind of summarizing what those points were. That's, again, not in my episode plan or my notes. It's just something that I do as we're having that live conversation. That keeps it from being too overly structured and helps to boil down those big takeaways for our listeners. And now my guest and I are on the same page and we're ready to record a great episode. In summary, what's worked really well is having tightly well-defined guest criteria, a very tight application process that all my guests go through, having that pre-interview call where I get a chance to know them and craft that narrative better, creating that personalized episode plan for each of my guests, and then following that plan and following that arc for the episode. Now, what should you do from here? Well, my biggest suggestion is create a plan for your episodes. When you just wing it and just show up unprepared and have just a conversation like you're meeting someone for the first time, which is what many podcast hosts do, you don't always end up with the greatest episode. Yes, you get content, but it's not the best structure. I find winging it is really disrespectful to my guest and to my audience, so I don't think it's fair just to wing it. I much prefer to have a plan that can be set up to deliver value for my audience, for my guest, and for everyone involved. Everyone deserves that better, I think. So look, you don't need to be as comprehensive as I am, right? But having some kind of plan is going to help you out tremendously. Now, if you like this episode, this little behind the scenes look at what we do in creating our episode plans for Your Business Growth Podcast, you'll love the podcast too. Please do rate this episode, rate the podcast, leave us a review. This is how you can help support the show, and it helps to attract more listeners like you who would love content just like this. So please do rate and review Your Business Growth Podcast, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you got a ton of value on how to create episode plans to create great podcast episodes.